Hello and welcome. Well, you're in for a treat tonight. I have with me an author from Colorado who just won a great contest, the Will Rogers Gold Medallion, and it's a real coup for those of you who know who Will Rogers is, and it's a book called LAKOTA COWBOY. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about the process of writing, which I always find fascinating when I get to talk to authors, and talk too about some of the really unique things about the research that my guest has pulled out of history and some of the stories from the book. So Jhon Hafnor is my guest, and welcome.
Thank
Jhon.
you. Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. Were you surprised when the book won the gold?
A little bit. I traveled to Fort Worth for the ceremonies, and I thought, bronze would be great, or silver. So it was nice.
Any award is great. You took, I remember hearing, about 10 years to write this book.
Right.
So that even makes an award more special, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't whip it out as
I did not whip it out.
You did
no.
not whip it out. What kind of feelings did you have as the years went on and you realized, I'm not done, I'm not ready, it's not where I want it to be? Was it frustrating or was it fun? Or
I think more fun than frustrating. I think the research was the really fun part for me, and that gave me sort of a body to work with. And the characters were wonderful. And a writer always hates to finish the book and leave those characters behind because they're part of your life.
Yeah, kind of like an actor who gets really into the character and maybe feels a kinship with the character.
Yeah.
How would you describe, I guess if we say the plot or the description of this book? It's rather unique in the way you handled the story.
The two main characters, one is the last open-range cowboy, an archetype. I mean, it would be hard to identify the actual last open-range cowboy.
Sure.
He was born in 1886, and full disclosure, he was my grandfather, and died in 1956. And the other protagonist is a Lakota chieftain or headman named stands for them, and he was born in 1856. So it's very much a period piece. About half of it is in the 1800s and the other half in the 1900s.
So going back to 1856 practically, right?
Right.
I'm negligent here in telling the viewers this is a fiction, but it's a historical or biographical fiction.
Right,
book.
yeah.
And his other books, he's written several, and we'll talk about those too, but his other books were all nonfiction. So this is a big difference. But how do you explain to a non-literary person what a historical or biographical fiction book is compared to just pure fiction?
Yeah. Well, a historical novel is set in a period very firmly, as this book is, and a biographical novel follows real characters, but in a fictionalized sense.
So you don't have all the facts about these people or this place.
Right.
But you have a lot of them?
That's what made the book interesting, the tracking down those little bits and pieces and connecting those then in a timeline.
That you didn't have.
That I didn't have.
know.
Right. And then filling in the blanks, for what you think might logically have happened.
I know you said to me once that you love the research part of it, and with a fiction book you wouldn't ordinarily need to do a lot of research, I'm thinking.
Right. It's kind of all up here in a pure
in a pure
fictional
fiction book.
Right. yeah.
So tell us some examples of how you did research on these two men who have been, deceased a long time.
Yeah, well, I used the Freedom of Information Act several times. I wanted to find out where they were at in important historical moments, like the Little Bighorn or Wounded Knee or events like that. And I was able to, the U.S. government was always doing census, keeping track of the Native Americans, more than they maybe needed to. But I came across one Native American census that listed the family of my protagonist, stands for them, sister, little sister, half-sister. And she had been born in 1879 in Canada, is all it said.
Okay.
So then I could follow the thread back to the Little Bighorn when Sitting Bull took a portion of the Lakota up into Canada, and logically then place my protagonist in Canada with Sitting Bull. So that became a chapter.
Sure. So that kind of research would kind of open up a gold mine in a sense.
It does,
wouldn't it?
does, yeah. And it gave me some structure to work around other than just a blank page or a blank pile of pages. So
Yeah.
maybe that made this book easier to write, but it took a
That
long
kind
time.
You also did a lot of interviews, I've heard, with actual elders of the Native American community in
Yes.
South Dakota, right?
Right, right.
So how did that go, and were they receptive to a white dude coming in from Colorado?
Because Cleve Berry, one of the protagonists, had a great relationship with his Lakota neighbors, that helped to open some doors, I think. And so I was able to speak with Herman Standing Bear and Charles, or Jumbo Standing Bear. Charles had actually remembered stands for them. So
Wow.
that was really helped me. He was a 10-year-old boy when Stands for Them died, but he remembered going to the powwows at the Stands for Them house, so that was
Well, that
really
would
valuable.
add some real authenticity to
yeah.
your experience of researching, wouldn't it?
Yes, and they've both passed on now, but an interesting little side note is that the Stands for Them family, the grandfather of Charles and Herman Standing Bear is Henry Standing Bear. He was a chieftain who inspired the Crazy Horse Monument and asked Ziolkowski, the sculptor, commissioned him to start the sculpture.
Oh my goodness! So that's a bit of trivia that's not so trivial.
Right, right.
Wow.
They say on the res that everybody's related to everybody, though, so I wasn't totally surprised by that.
But that's
Yeah.
very cool to know. Do you feel that as a white man, the Native Americans that you interviewed or that have read the book are a little unsure about having someone that's not Native American come in and write about someone that's beloved, really, in their
Right.
culture?
Yeah. I think there was some of that. The way I countered that, partly, hopefully, is that I had a consultant who worked hand in glove with me, and his name was Jhon Goes In Center. And I've known him about 20 years, and so he was helpful in reviewing many of the chapters and pointing out things that were maybe not quite right from his perspective. He's in his mid-70s now, and when I met him, he lived west of Pine Ridge Village on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and it is an Ogala Lakota elder of some note. So that was, I think, important.
Right, I would think so. And then if anyone does question you, you can mention.
I can mention that
Jhon.
I tried, yeah, and Jhon was very helpful.
And his last name again was?
Goes In Center.
Goes In Center, okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, so you had to, though, probably almost, it was almost, I'm guessing, a necessity to have input from someone like Jhon.
Yes, oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
And the other interviews were critical
Yeah,
to
I
the
would think.
authenticity of the book.
And
yeah.
how old, I was just wanting to go back to the two elders that you did get to really talk with quite a bit. How old were they?
Oh, late 80s for Charles.
Thinking they'd be
yeah,
up there if
yeah,
they knew
yeah.
stands for them.
Right, yeah.
One of the things that I thought, I've read the book, of course, and one of the things that I found really intriguing was how you kept going back. He would write about the Native American stands for them from childhood on, and as well as your grandfather, and he would alternate. So
Right.
we'd hear about the young boy growing up, with all the tribal customs, and then we'd hear about the young homesteader boy.
Right.
And how did you? Is that done often? I don't see that often.
Yeah, I guess it worked, I did put in dates at the start of every chapter to kind of give people a sense of where we were weaving between the two characters. They were actually of different generations, about 30 years apart in age, so that was a little tricky as well.
They also had different languages.
Right, yeah.
And so how did they communicate, do you suppose?
They, as my mother told it, they would go out under a tree and have a cup of coffee or maybe a nip of whiskey or whatever, and just hang out together and somehow communicate ideas back and forth. Stands for them spoke very little English, and my grandfather spoke some Lakota, but not much.
So some nonverbal
Right. Yeah.
communication going on.
Yeah.
And sometimes we hear jokes about men going fishing and they hardly talk as they're throwing in,
Yeah.
the lines.
Well, I'll give you an example, Mary, if I might. At one point, they were sitting out on a hot day, and stands for them shirt was unbuttoned. They needed the breeze, and it showed the scars from the Sundance that he had been involved in.
Which is a kind of rite of passage.
Right, where you're sometimes hung actually suspended by these thongs and ropes.
Oh, you are, John?
The participants are
I
in a
didn't know
trance-like
that
state.
was that extreme.
Yeah, it happened.
Wow.
So anyway, with those scars on his chest, they were able to sort of nod at each other and
Oh.
communicate a story.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. That's a good example, a dramatic example.
Yes.
Well, in terms of language, you also, I remember you're telling me earlier, you also told me that there were things you learned about the Native American language that were fascinating in terms of naming. Can you give us an example of that?
I can. Native Americans 600 years ago did not have the horse. And the horses were introduced. Horses were in North America, but that was millions of years ago. So the horse was brought to North America by the Spanish, primarily. Many of those
Coming
horses,
up from Mexico.
right, up from Mexico and up from what is now the southwest part of the United States, and became wild in some cases and were traded in some cases. But Native Americans then acquired the horse, and they had always used the dog as a beast of burden, and the dogs could pull a small tent or provisions or whatever, and the Lakota word for dog is shunka. And when the Native Americans, the Lakota in particular, had this wonderful big dog, they called it Shunkawakan, which translates loosely as God's dog or the holy dog.
Yeah, that's just a fascinating difference, isn't it,
Isn't it?
between our languages?
Right.
So how then do you think we, with the English language, thought of the word horse?
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
That's another piece of research.
Another interview.
Uh-huh.
There is a glossary in the back of Lakota Cowboy
Right.
that explains the Lakota words.
Yeah, that was fun.
There's about
to,
90 of them sprinkled
Yeah,
through.
not a huge amount, but
Yeah.
fun to learn some of the words, although the spellings are
Yeah.
very complex.
And the pronunciations I wouldn't even sometimes try. Yeah.
I was just in Iceland, and if you've been in Iceland, that language is akin to the Native American language in terms of long words, long names, hard to pronounce,
Yeah.
hard to remember. Oh,
Yeah,
goodness.
for sure.
You also found some really interesting cultural differences, and one that I read about that you've mentioned is the way women had quite a lot of high-level respect and power, if we use that word,
Right.
in the Lakota culture,
Right.
and probably still do.
Right. I can
Tell us about.
an example from the book.
Yeah,
Would
that'd
you
be
prefer?
great.
Great. So Stance for Them grew up as a Minneconjou Lakota. So under the Lakota umbrella, there are other sub-tribes. You've heard of the Ogala, the Shikanju, the Minneconjou, perhaps. He grew up Minneconjou, but he married a woman of the Wajaja, loosely Ogallala tribe. So he became, when a man marries a woman, he becomes a member of her tribe and not the other way around, which we might have expected. Also, the woman owned the teepee in the Lakota culture, and marriage was a really, really simple ceremony, and divorce was a really simple ceremony. So since she owned the teepee, if they were getting divorced, she would take his possessions, put them just outside the door, and then everybody knew that marriage was over.
We sort of have jokes about it, you know, people
Right. Yeah.
throwing their spouses' clothes out on the sidewalk, but this was their
was-
regular way of
Right.
doing
It was done in a more proper way, but you
Uh-huh.
know, she would stack his, and then people knew they were not a couple
that was
anymore.
It. That
Yeah.
was it for that couple.
Yeah.
If you could share a story from your grandfather's life early on, I think of one I'd love to hear, but you may want to pick anything that pops into your mind. But his life was not easy as a young homesteading family boy and then man.
Mhm.
The story I think about from the book that I found especially fascinating was when he was sent out as a young 15, 16-year-old to take care of cattle over some winter months,
Right.
living outdoors in a tent.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Well, his sister's husband had taken the cattle in for sale in perhaps Omaha and had not returned, and there were some questions why not, but she was stuck with all this livestock and a place to graze them, but no one to take them out. Her sons were too young. So she called on her brother in her hour of need.
Her little brother.
Her little brother, my grandfather, to ride over on horseback and take these cattle to an open range area by the Niobrara River, where he had to spend the whole winter with them out there taking care of them because there were no fences. Bring them back in closer. Cattle, there's an advantage to a cowboy because cattle will only go about 2 or 3 miles from a known water source. So they don't just take off
They're not going
forever.
to run.
But you still have to kind of keep him close to
Sure.
where his tent was. So he lived that winter, northern Nebraska, in a tent with a little tiny stove. And the stories my mother told were things like he would have to take the potatoes to bed with him at night, or they would be frozen in the morning, and that would have been his breakfast. So
Can you
had to
imagine?
keep him warm.
And I mean,
Hard.
winter back in 1900 or thereabouts, I bet they were even harder than average winters now.
Right. He felt he went into that winter as a boy and came out as a man.
And not the easy way.
Right.
We're getting close to out of time. I want to always, John, you wouldn't know, not being in Minnesota and watching the show, but we always give information at the end for people to learn more. So I want to hold up the book, first of all,
Okay.
that we're talking about. So this is Lakota Cowboy, and it mentions the big award at the top.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get a close-up of that. And then how would people find the book if they don't find it at their bookstore?
Yeah. Amazon, Apple Books, or Google Play. It's in both a print version, which you're holding, and also an ebook version as well.
Okay.
People want that on their Kindle or whatever.
Okay.
So
And for people to get a hold of you if they wanted to ply you with more questions?
Sure.
How would they get a
It
hold
would
of
be
you then?
Jhon.Hafnor, so that's Jhon as it's normally spelled, .HAFNOR @gmail.com.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You've written several other books, and as I said, nonfiction. Black Hills Believable, Strange But True America, and Strange But True Colorado.
Right.
And these were all kind of short, easy sections to read and fun to write, I'm guessing.
Fun to write.
Also very, very neatly illustrated.
Right, yeah. Let me just show people a little bit about the illustrations. Dale Crawford of Colorado. Hitler owned a ranch in Colorado. I just flipped to that. People don't know that.
Hold it longer
Oh,
so people can
Sure.
see it, or they can
Anyway,
zoom in.
there's his drawing of Adolf Hitler. So really strange stories like that, and very fun to research.
And they're doing well,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
being sold in, of course, Colorado and the Black Hills, but
Right,
all around. With,
And the same places, Amazon,
oh, okay, sure.
Apple Books, and,
Sure.
and Google Play. Yeah.
So now you've birthed the last book, your Lakota Cowboy. Do you have another book in your mind? I mean, you're kind of on a roll, John.
Yeah. So there's sort of a revival of all things Western that has been started by the runaway hit TV show Yellowstone. So it's got people thinking about Western themes and cowboys and Native Americans. And so my publisher really wants a sequel to Lakota Cowboy. There's a kind of a surprise ending, which we can't give here, to Lakota Cowboy, but there is a character that we could move forward with in the sequel, which I'm working on right now.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
we'll look forward to that. I just, in closing, want to say that I really loved reading this book and highly recommend it. I found myself feeling so close to the Native American young man as he grew older, and then as he was in his older years, not able to get a pension from the president who he wrote to. And so I appreciated your writing so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.